¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta conversación de la Cátedra Alfonso Reyes. Estamos muy contentos, estamos muy orgullosos también de tener para ustedes esta conversación entre una de las neurocientíficas más reconocidas del continente americano y nuestra muy querida profesora, la doctora Lourdes Epstein, quien durante muchos años fue directora de la Biblioteca del Campus Ciudad de México, del Tecnológico de Monterrey, y que a su vez es también especialista en temas de literatura, lectura y construcción de la ciudadanía. Con muchísimo gusto vamos a cederle la palabra a Lourdes Epstein para conversar sobre cómo funciona nuestro cerebro, si somos como seres humanos, seres narradores por excelencia. ¿Qué sucede cuando narramos o escuchamos narrar en términos emocionales y cómo nuestra emoción afecta nuestra capacidad de conocer? Sobre estos temas fundamentales para conocernos mejor como seres humanos es que tratará esta conversación de hoy, que será en inglés y que más adelante tendremos la traducción para ustedes. Así es que bienvenidas y bienvenidos, y con mucho gusto les cedo la palabra a Lourdes Epstein. Welcome, Lourdes.
Thanks, Ana Laura. I would like to start thanking the Cathedral.
I think tu micrófono creo que está apagado, Lourdes.
Sorry.
Perfecto.
No? Do you hear me? Okay. As I was saying, I would like to thank Cátedra Alfonso Reyes for the invitation to moderate this conversation. I'm very honored to share this team space of our institution to talk with Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and welcome. Before presenting Dr. Immordino-Yang's profile, I would like to share with you that I came across her work through Andrew Huberman's podcast. I immediately connected her proposal with the experience we had at the School of Humanities and Education at Tec de Monterrey, designing and implementing citizen laboratories. Understanding that our biology is inherently a social one, promoting safe spaces to create horizontally and collaboratively the meanings and the narratives of a just and inclusive civic life is, in my opinion, an urgent aspiration of any educational system. And so I am very excited to have the opportunity to talk with a researcher who have traveled the paths of sciences and the humanities to offer us, and in times of crisis like the ones we are living, a hopeful alternative for analysis and practice. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, Doctor of Education in Human Development and Psychology, studies the psychological and neurobiological basis of social emotion, self-awareness and culture, and their implications for learning, development, and schools. She is a professor of education at the USC Brosher School of Education, a professor of psychology at the Brain and Creativity Institute, a member of the Neurosciences Graduate Program faculty at the University of Southern California, and director of the USC Center for Effective Neurosciences, Development, Learning, and Education. Of course, her profile goes a long way, but I would like to start the conversation right now. Dr. Immordino, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person in your beautiful country, but at least this makes a visit possible.
Yeah, for the next time, we'll love to have you here. And I will start. I have prepared some questions. I will start with the first one, but feel free to go wherever you want to go, answering the questions. I know you have a lot of experience. For me, it was a little bit difficult to develop these questions because I'm not, of course, a scientific in your field, but I think you cross over and have a important link between the humanities and sciences and a personal experience we love to hear from. So in my first question, although much of our education systems are changing, we are still suffering, as Edward Wilson puts it, from trying to accommodate our Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions, and all of this steered by the uncomprehended forces of technology. You mentioned in the podcast the metaphor of the cart before the horses, concerning, I think, the faulty situation of the emphasis education puts on performance instead of development. How recent, and this is the question, how recent scientific research outcomes can help us look into the right direction concerning what we aim in education?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying thank you for this kind invitation. It's really quite an honor to be speaking with you today, and I'm just so happy to be here. And I think you're asking a really important question, Lourdes, which is, kind of what is the science teaching us about what it means to be a human being? And how can we use the insights from the science to inform the way we support human beings, and especially human beings who are really most actively growing and changing and developing themselves, which are our young people. And so I think what we're learning is that, traditionally in education, we have thought about, in Western style education and Western style schooling, we've thought about, emotions and cognition as being separate things. Maybe there's a recognition that they impact each other, right? That they actually are, have something to do with each other. But what we now know is that, there's really kind of thinking, there's people being and thinking in the real world. And as scientists, we're trained to try to shine kind of different lights and methodologies onto the behavior so that we can isolate particular dimensions of the behavior for study so that we can analyze and understand it. But that doesn't mean that in the real person, those things are actually separate pieces interacting, right? In the real person, they're actually two dimensions of one thing. So I would argue that we have vastly underestimated the degree to which our thinking is actually an emotional process. It's not that emotions impact cognition or cognition drives emotion, but that thinking itself is inherently both cognitive and emotional all the time. And the brain studies that we've been conducting and others have been conducting demonstrate this, I think. And so we can study cognition as a thing, as a construct, a dimension of thinking, and we can study emotion or affect as another dimension of thinking. But when we do that, we need to remember that we're just holding half the story constant and not looking at it. In actuality, all those things are there all the time. And this is true about the social nature of our thinking, also the acculturated nature of our thinking. We often think about culture as something that kind of gets painted on the outside of the person to look a particular way or to dress or a particular way or celebrate a certain thing. But actually the deep situated cultural nature of human development is ubiquitous. It's impossible to have a human being without culture. Culture is what actually teaches our biology how to grow. It teaches our brain how to develop. It is what's organizing the relationships around us so that we can interact with other people and learn from them and learn from the artifacts that we put in the world together, and then develop the sort of characteristic patterns of thinking that are normative in the groups that are around us and become one of the group, right? This is how our biology works. And yet in schools, we really persist in thinking about, like you said, thinking about achievement as being sort of these discrete, isolatable, measurable outcomes that a kid can do on a particular day, at a particular time, in a particular way, when you do need to be able to do these things. I'm not at all saying you don't, but that's not actually the point of education. Those are the means, right, not the aim. They're like the stuff that's in the horse's cart, like you said before, but we need to educate the horse, right? And the horse needs stuff in their cart so that they have, the stuff with them that they need as they're going along. But we need to really focus on what kind of horse are we growing, right? That's the development. That's the person who's pulling that cart. Are they shy of trees in the wind, right? Are they friendly with other horses? Do they know how to manage themselves in the world? Are they willingly going forward, right? These kinds of demeanors of the person are really what matter the most as an outcome of schooling. And the learning that we're doing in school is really in service of developing these patterns of being and thinking, which are, of course, built out of stuff experienced in a lived context. So we tend to really systematically neglect the role of what we call autobiographical memory, the experience for having been there, right? That is the core of our human memory processes, and only focus on the discrete pieces that got kind of hooked into that core. And that is actually a major problem, because when the little pieces don't stick, right, or the little things you know how to do don't transfer across domains, we have no model for understanding why that is. But it makes perfect sense why it is if you understand that the core of human learning and memory is autobiographical. It's the experience of being there. It's the interaction of yourself with others, with things in the world. It's the lived processes and adaptations that we actively engage as we're moving through the world with others and being and doing and thinking. And naturally, we're adapting ourselves to those contexts. And the things that we're learning how to do along the way are sort of building themselves into the whole of our autobiographical self. And yet we neglect that self in the design of schooling.
Yeah, sure. I think I would like you to develop a little more the idea between, you just said that emotions and cognition are always together. Mm-hmm. How does the narrative enters the scene where emotions and cognition are playing?
Yeah, I think what you're asking is, what is a narrative? Is that what you're asking? Kind of.
And what is the place narratives has in this story?
Yeah, that's right. Well, so if we think about narrative very, very broadly, right? So narrative, we often think of narrative as sort of based in words and language, right? But I want us to think about it as something much broader than that for a moment. I mean, there are narratives based in words and stories and language, and those are really important. But there are other kinds of narratives, narratives in quotes, that are kind of lived chains of experiences, the ways you know how to be, how to feel, and the reasons why you believe those things to be the way they are. And those belief systems, those structures of relationships, your mental models for understanding the world are sort of inferred from the stories we tell ourselves, either explicitly or implicitly, right, about how the world works, which we learn by acting in the world with other people. And by, seeing how that goes, and by managing ourselves and adapting to new kinds of situations, and watching what others are doing and trying to figure out their intentions, and then trying to evaluate those intentions, and then adopting some of them ourselves. And all of this is deeply situated in complex cultural spaces that are at once, biologically grounded in the management of your own body and brain in the world, right? Literally keeping yourself alive and moving through space and time, managing your physiology and your brain activity in patterns that are actually useful and adaptive. And so narratives emerge from our ability. So narratives is what makes human beings unique, I think, in their truest, fullest form. Other animals surely have very simple ones that aren't narrated with language, right? But, sort of lived stories, sets of associations, and chained together patterns of things that tend to happen one, then the next, right? That you ought to feel in particular ways about, right? Like my dog gets excited when I come downstairs and have a leash in my hand, and then he's like, oh, I get to go for a walk, right? And so he runs over the door and starts barking like, let's go for a walk, right? He sees the leash, he sees me, he's done it so many times that he knows what's going to happen, and he starts to, anticipate that and get excited. That's a very, very simple proto-narrative of the sort that, only, little teeny human beings do, 18, 20-month-old, 22-month-old kids, right? But what's amazing about human beings is that we can go on. We still have those very lived association, sort of chained association narratives that are part of who we are, for sure. But we can also go on to then build other levels of what I would call more transcendent narratives, representational narratives, narratives that start to become mental capacities that you might call concepts, ideas of what it means to take a walk, not just doing the actual walk right now, right? Even with a 2-year-old child, you can say, oh, well, let's have our lunch and our nap now so we can take a walk later to grandma's house, right? And that child can go climb into their lunch table, not run to the door, right? Because they know, oh, okay, this is the logic of the whole situation. I'm starting to construct a story in my mind about what's going to be happening. And then we can move with development into the most acculturated, sophisticated kinds of narratives that actually transcend any particular concept or context that's actually in the real social physical world, in the sense of being able to look and see it. So we learn to build narratives about concepts that explain a range of phenomena, like the narrative of how gravity works, and why our feet stick to the ground, and why the moon pulls the tides, and why a ball rolls down a ramp, all have the same story behind them, right? There's an idea of what's going on behind that you're inferring from many examples and from learning about the complexities of matter and the way that it behaves. And similarly, we can build and do very complex sort of transcendent narratives that transcend any particular situation, that are about who you are in any situation. We call that identity, things like morals, ethics, beliefs, deeper understandings of what's happening, of the values and beliefs behind the systems of institutional, rules and things like that we have. Those inferences, those complex inferences that organize the way in which we sort of make sense of and systematize society are in effect narratives that we construct in our own mind. And what's really important to link this back to our previous question that you asked is that these narratives are not simply cognitive, in the sense that they just are constructed in a sort of value neutral, emotion neutral sort of, just discretely cognitive way, without any investment or in one way or the other being better or worse, or being what feels good or right versus wrong or bad. And so human beings, and in fact all living creatures, bring an inherent sense of evaluation to the things that we construct, the meaning we construct in the world. And that evaluation is very subjective. It's built from our own lived experiences in a context, whether they're very simple ones like my dog, who knows it's fun to go for walks, so he's happy when he sees the leash, right? To much more complex ideas like about developmental science and the future of the education system and what it means for what's possible for humanity, right? These are incredibly complex ideas that are inferred from knowing a lot about many, many systems of actual concrete happenings in the world. And those more complex narratives that start to explain the why, the reasoning, the workings behind systems, those are what make us really uniquely human. And again, in education, we tend, of course, we live by these narratives because we're humans, that's what we do. But we tend to keep them sort of hidden or off limits for explicitly analyzing them in the context of schools, amongst teachers and between teachers and students and amongst students. And I think that the disposition to construct narratives that can be examined, that can be queried, that can be systematically evaluated for their ethical implications, their sustainability, their underlying intentions and beliefs, to really think about a narrative about what and why things are the way they are that might have been completely unquestioned before, which suddenly you can come to realize is leading some people to be underprivileged relative to other people. Things like that, you must systematically develop dispositions for thinking about those narratives as the ideas that organize the intentions behind our actions and our institutional systems and their design. So I think the idea of these stories and the propensity to query these stories, to step back and examine them, to analyze them, to compare them with other people's stories, to start to figure out why I think the way I do and what it is that I actually think. Those are the dispositions of mind that are essential for a successful humanistic education system that's going to facilitate the growth and development of the next generation of young people who are actually well situated and adapted to building a sustainable, ethical world.
Well, that's really amazing to think about the humanities and emotions put in the same context, trying to build capacity, ability to understand and translate many of different and new components our young generation is facing that, for example, I didn't face when I was their age. So really, we need, as you say, to reframe the schools. You talk about the need to reframe experiences, outcomes, and aims of education to have a better perspective of our civic life.
Yes.
But how does this reframing deals with an education system that is afraid of the agency of our students? We say we promote the agency of students, but in the real terms, we don't.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
How do we meet the needs of a school determined to promote meaning-making spaces, not only meaning learning mechanisms?
Yeah.
How can we embrace diversity as we allow meaning-making safely?
Yeah, that is a huge question. It's a question we're grappling with all over the world right now. And I think, I mean, I have some insights into it, but I also think that we're going to need to figure this out going forward. And it's going to look different in different places because the approaches, the values, the culture in different places are going to be different. And that is wonderful, right? But there are some key core values that I think we need to espouse as a species at this point in our evolution. And those have to do with the development of trust between people, a sense of equity and fairness, and of lack of harm, a sense that this equity and fairness and lack of harm extends beyond human beings to animals, to the environment, to our planet. And when we don't consider it that way, we're going to end up with a very, very serious planetary crisis, which we're already on the brink of, right, in terms of our environment and our ability to actually sustain ourselves in the world that we have, like in the actual planet we have. And so I think we need to get brave about understanding that what we're really aiming for in education is not, like you said before, the little discrete learning outcomes that are in the cart behind the horse. We need those, but they're the means to developing the horse. And we need to understand that young people must live experienced things for them to develop these dispositions. These are not things that you can put in somebody, right? These are things that we can help to build in someone by organizing environments and experiences for them and learning opportunities for them that are sort of supportive of them discovering and inventing for themselves the meaning that's in the world. We can't give the next generation our meaning. It isn't relevant anymore once it's not us. But what we can do is teach them to systematically query the values and beliefs that undergird the meaning they're making, stop and reflect with other people about why you believe the things you do, how you understand the things that you do, and how you could contribute beneficially to the world, and what skills and knowledge you would need to be able to do that, and then to have the self-determination and the self-awareness to be able to actually go ahead and learn those things that you know you need because you have work to do in the world that's going to serve some aspect of society in a beneficial way, from technology to humanistic jobs to healthcare to to every single kind of profession or work or family role that exists, right? And so I think what it really comes down to is that we need to really reframe and understand that, like you said, I think you're absolutely right. We're afraid for people to actually start to query the beliefs and intentions that undergird some of our best established, most entrenched systems, like some of the systems that are the structure for our education system. Because the reality is those structures and those intentions, when you actually start to poke at them, reveal not always beneficial intentions. They really systematically set up some kinds of people to have more access to opportunity than other kinds of people. And that's frightening for us to realize that, for those of us who have been in the privileged, side. And it's also frightening to notice for those who've been in the side whose opportunities have been curtailed, that we need to work together to rebuild a system that actually reflects the values that we bring to the world today. And it's frightening, and I think also hugely inspiring, right? But what we really need to do is do this in ways that really teach young people to be systematically thinking about the implications of what they believe, the implications of what they do, and to query one another about those implications, because there are no right answers, right? It's very complex and dynamic at that point. And we can set up education systems that give kids the genuine opportunity to think about the complexities of the civic landscape and the technological landscape and the humanistic and cultural landscape that we live in. But that's not what our education system is mainly focused around. And there are systems that do focus around those kinds of civic and humanistic and cultural sort of goals of education and those domains of inquiry for humans. And they do amazing things, but we need those to be much more mainstream at this point. Right now, they're mainly reserved for either the kids who are so disenfranchised that nobody really cares what happens to them. So sometimes they can have these very alternative ways of doing education, or highly privileged kids who can afford to take a risk and not learn the standard way that gets you the standard accolades and access to higher education and things like that, because you have the resources and the means to be able to circumvent the barriers and the blockades. But what we really need to do is think about, what do we want for our young people? We need to step back as the adults organizing the system. We need to step back and say, what makes a good citizen? And how would we design opportunities for young people to grow themselves into good citizens? What would those opportunities look like? What would they have to have experienced? How would they be supported in reflecting on those experiences? What kinds of knowledge would they need to have sort of built into those experiences? What kinds of things would they need to learn via those experiences? And how can we think much more systematically about not just what kids know from having learned things, but the dispositions of mind that they have developed through having learned those things that we're measuring right now as the outcomes.
Wow. Yeah. When you think about planning school projects, for example, and starting in the position of there is no right answer.
Right.
This is a complete different scenario for school, even for elementary school. What do
Yeah, that's right.
When you begin by stating that there is no right answer?
Right.
So I think that's the correct position to start with, but it's difficult for our schools to be in that position, to have the humility to recognize that is the real position, especially because our values or our systems or our discourses and narratives are not functioning right now. We have to invent, at least
yes, we're at a real junction point, like a Kuhnian shift or a Copernican shift. I'm talking about it, right? Where it's like suddenly Copernicus realized, other people too, right? That, we're watching all these stars and planets go by, right? But the thing is, we can describe them that way and it works okay most of the time. But sometimes things go retrograde and, and we don't really know why. And some things don't quite make sense to us. And when you realize that, if we reframe the model, we can have the same data, but if we're positioning at the center the sun rather than ourselves, all of a sudden these other complexities start to be much more parsimoniously explained. They start to make sense why Mars would go retrograde, because we're moving too, right? And we're passing each other in the orbit, right? All of a sudden, but doing that, like you said, requires a huge amount of mental flexibility and also humility, because it changes the way in which we understand our own selves very profoundly sometimes, right? Like in the case of the Copernican shift, it was a hugely problematic notion, because all of a sudden human beings are not in the center of the universe, right? Like some other thing is in the center of the universe and we're just going around like everybody else, right? Like all the other planets, right? And I think here, and it's not that, there are, any answer to a math problem is equally as good. There's the correct way to use the mathematics, right? But there are many ways to think about phenomena mathematically. And that's where there's really no, right? There are ways that are, it's not incorrect to think about the Earth as the center of the solar system. You can describe the solar system from our vantage point, but it's just not a very parsimonious way to do it. It's a really complicated way to do it. right? And so that's what I mean by no right answer. You can learn that there are more parsimonious, more direct, better ways to think about things, right? But that doesn't mean that those are the right way. There is no right way, but there are ways to do it. And you can think about, by doing it in different ways, what do you gain? What do you lose? What are you able to measure and see when you look at it this way versus that way, right? If you use calculus versus add up a whole little bunch of boxes, right, to try to get the area under the bridge, which one is useful in different ways? And I think that it's that kind of thinking that we really need to encourage in our young people. But it's work. It's work for the educators. It's a different kind of work than what we traditionally think of as teachers' work. Normally, we think of teachers as knowing stuff, kids as not knowing stuff, and then the teacher's job is to tell the stuff or show the stuff or give the stuff somehow. And then the kid's job is to ingest the stuff and be able to retrieve and recall it later. And learning science is all about the best way to make sure that you're going to be able to recall and retrieve something later, right? But there's nothing in there about like, why do you need this? What is this? What does it mean really? How does it relate to the stuff we were learning last week in literature class, this mathematics or physics, right? And these things are actually all coming from cultural ways of knowing. They're deeply interconnected with one another, all of these ways of understanding the world. And they're all very fundamentally human at their core, right? They reflect the kind of minds that we have. I think that the Antonio and Hannah Damasio, who founded the amazing institute that I'm lucky enough to have my lab at, the Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. I mean, I think this was their intention, was to highlight that. We have this amazing institute with like a performance space in the middle of meeting spaces and an art gallery and scientific brain imaging equipment, all docked in together into one institute that explores the nature of human creativity, right? And I think that we need to think about it more that way in education. We need to backwards design lessons that are thinking not just about what is the kid gonna know and be able to do. That's important, but that's not enough. And how are they going to grow themselves as a thinker, as a person? How are they going to change who they are developmentally for having learned to know and to do these things? And when we think about it that way, it really changes the profession of teaching to something that I think is fascinating. It's really much more of a developmental kind of longer term view that teachers are being asked to take. They're being asked to think about how do these kids, how are they building and changing and growing themselves as human beings through the opportunities that I'm orchestrating for them to engage with the world? And how can I support them in doing that in the varied ways that they will do it, but also support them in understanding and practicing and developing skills for managing themselves at the boundaries of that and knowing what's acceptable, what is not acceptable, and why, right? And what kinds of values and beliefs we together as a community hold, and how do we query those beliefs in the space of moving through what's an acceptable way to solve problems. And so I think, that is a much more developmentally oriented, longer term, humanistic approach to supporting the growth and development of young people whom you could call adapted, skilled, ethical, constructive citizens who can actively contribute to their worlds in many different ways. And that's not actually what we're trying to accomplish right now in education, although good teachers, of course, and good, know that this is what you ultimately want. But we think it's in conflict with learning math or with learning humanities or with, learning how to make perspective in a drawing, when actually all of those things are really tools for understanding something bigger about the world and the human condition, but we don't frame them that way. We don't make it about empowering the person, allowing them to express and use their agency to make sense out of things using the academic tools that we're here to introduce you to. You know, reading, you learn it because you need it, because you really want information. The only way you can get it, or the best way to get it, is by looking at what other people have written. Don't you want to know what they said? You're going to need to learn to read, right? Don't you want to know how to figure this out and compute and make predictions? You're going to need to learn some math. Let me help you with it, right? Or some chemistry, or some biology, or some physics, or something in the arts or humanities. Don't you want to make it so other people understand the experience that you're trying to share with them that comes from your personal experience or your family history? Then you're going to need to learn skills in the arts so that you can leverage them to express what you want other people to share in with you, right? And so the academic learning becomes something that is necessary, that kids are hungry for, because it's a tool for them to express and build their own agency in the world.
Well, now that you talk about creativity and art, my next question has to do with it.
Okay.
Because if living is a process of embodiment of our stories and the stories of others around us, how come, at least in Mexico, that is happening, the study of the humanities is disappearing across the curriculum?
Yeah.
At least in undergraduate students. And in general, I think that we are more preoccupied about learning mechanics and physics and mathematics because they are the strong subjects we need to learn. I had the experience of trying to convince a professor of engineering why he should introduce reading literature or fiction to complete the education of all students, no matter what subjects are they in. Shouldn't we put, for example, literature or reading fiction, for example, as fundamental transversal components of learning at any age?
Yeah, yes, that's the answer. But why, right? I mean, why? And I do think that the pulling back of the humanities in Mexico, we are seeing something very similar in the U.S. around, arts education, right, and other kinds of, extracurriculars, having music programs or having these things. When kids are struggling to read or to learn math, we cut back, or we don't have the money, we always cut back the arts, we cut back things like that. Although now people are really actively realizing, especially with the pandemic and the mental health crisis we're experiencing, they're realizing that that's a mistake. And like, for example, in California recently, there was a new law passed where school districts now universally have to give a certain percentage of their funding towards arts education, right? So there's pushing back in the other direction, but why? The question is why, and why? What do you tell this engineering professor who says, "I just need my kids to know really good calculus and really good physics because I need them to build bridges," right? But the question is, how do you expect those young people with these incredibly sturdy skills to go out in the world and know what to use them for, right? Bridges to where, right? For whom, right? To what end? If you're destroying the rainforest building this bridge, or you're stomping on the land of indigenous peoples who have lived there, right? I mean, should you notice? Is that something you need to know about, right? We need to think about the technical skills. I mean, the reason I think that countries and schools all over the world have focused on the technical skills is because those are essential and they've been lacking, and they take a lot of formal education opportunities because people are unlikely to discover them on their own moving through the world, right? But the thing is, and they make a country productive, let's just say that, right? They make you able to build and do things that are going to earn money for the country, which is all good. But we need to really think about, who are the humans who are doing this? Are we building little robot humans who are just going to go out and do widgets with their chemistry skills or whatever it is? Or are they actually going to think about, wait a minute, why is the lead pipes and this hurting the people? What's going on? I need my chemistry to be able to solve a problem that's extremely important to the children who live in these neighborhoods or whatever it is, right? That was a story of what happened in a place called Flint, Michigan in the United States a couple of years ago, where there turned out to be very high levels of lead in the water that was going to families' homes, and it caused brain damage in children. It's like we need whole humans who can understand the story of why their skills matter and how to use them. If you don't have an intuitive appreciation of this, think about the story of Robert Oppenheimer, right? That just came out in a big movie. The physics is amazing. The innovations in our understanding of the nature of matter and energy is amazing. But who steps back and thinks like, wait a minute, what are we trying to actually accomplish? Why are we doing this? And what are we going to be able to use it for, right? That kind of orientation both improves the quality of the science itself, because it helps you think in many ways about the nature of the problem, but it also improves the way the science is developed and applied in society, because it helps us understand what we need and why we need it. We can go develop all kinds of AI technologies right now, for example. What would they do to the ways that our systems and our structures and our individuals are functioning? We need people who are building AI to have a sense of psychology, of sociology, of the ways that these are likely to shape the story of who we become as a species, in order for them to use their technical skills in responsible ways. So to think that we can just become efficient, little robots by teaching people all the technical skills, leaving off the more humanistic aspects of their development as a person, is building a horse that is a dangerous one. It'll just go wherever you tell it. Or hopefully that's what, people in power would like, right? And do what you want it to do. Just keep pulling the cart, horse, keep going that way, right? Without ever thinking about, like, why did you never go in the woods? Why did you never walk over there and meet the donkey on the other side? It's like, silly in my example, but it's like, we need people who are people, not people who are machines.
Well, yeah, I see perfectly. This is the aim of education. But talking about safe cultural spaces to think together about our civic discourse, how can we, in a practical way, deconstruct beliefs and achieve shared understanding and engagement in education? There's a battle in the world, not only in Mexico or in America, but in the whole world, of how and what has value, and how can we aim to this point if we don't believe that point has value. We have right now we have a lot of problems merging together different situations, translating different situations. How can we very practically create these safe spaces to think together?
Yeah. So, I think in schools, there's been a lot of work on this in education recently in the US. For example, the US National Academy of Education put out a really nice report on civic discourse and reasoning. And then there's an accompanying set of reports that I helped to contribute to also about what civic discourse and reasoning looks like in mathematical settings, in social science, in science, in culture, right? So that's a really wonderful, evidence-based discussion of how we start to build out schooling systems that really fully develop the capacities of people to not just have skills, but to use them in ways that are strategic and useful and beneficial, and also that make them happy. That's the elephant in the room, is that for the most part, people who are just feeling like cogs in a machine, learning particular technical skills without really any connection to what they mean for them as a person or the broader utility of these in the world. People burn out. That actually isn't very inspiring to the majority of people. And we end up with only a very small subset of people being able to manage themselves in the school system like that. So yeah, so in terms of the practicalities, there are lots of strategies. They involve things like training teachers to understand the developmental trajectory that their students are on as compared to just what content they need to know, right? We typically think of a chemistry teacher needs to have knowledge of chemistry and knowledge of how to run a classroom, right? But that's actually completely insufficient. They also need in-depth knowledge of adolescent growth and development and how adolescents are learning to think, right? I mean, we know intuitively it'd be ridiculous to send teachers into a preschool classroom with 3-year-olds who have no idea about preschool age development. You know, what's normative in that age? What are they working on? Right? What kinds of things are difficult for them still? And how would you support them? Right? But when it comes to older kids, middle and high school, even elementary school, middle, high school, and into post-secondary, we expect them to just sort of leave those aspects of themselves at the door. And that's a problem. And it leads, I think, to the kinds of mental health problems that we have right now, where people feel dissociated from the work. I mean, the kids ask, why do I need to know this, right? This isn't what matters to me, right? When that kind of question is coming up in class, you know you have a problem with the design of your curriculum. If kids are asking you, why do I need to know this? You haven't set up the curriculum well, right? And then I think, what were you asking? I just lost my train of thought. There was one other thing I was going to mention. Oh, how else to do this? I mean, right. So, but it needs to be done well. So there's no like one answer to do this and it fixes it, right? You know, it can be done better or worse depending on the level of understanding that the teacher brings to the setting, right? And that the administrators are using to support them. But things like project-based learning, right? Where you're set with a problem and then you have to figure out ways to solve that problem together with other people that use the tools you need to be learning. And then performance-based assessments. So rather than asking people just to take a test on the technical skills, which is useful at a certain point in your development, that actually tells you something useful, but only when it's framed in a broader trajectory of using this information and learning it. And then that becomes a test of this one piece and not the whole entirety of what you're aiming for as an education system, right? But thinking about supporting people in really breaking down the kinds of thinking and skills and models that different disciplinary domains bring them for certain kinds of problems, and then reflecting in a public way, either through writing or through like almost like a dissertation defense kind of thing, but in a smaller way for younger kids, where there's community members and teachers and peers who are asking them and querying them about their process. Like, why did you do it this way? What if you'd done it this other way? You know, what else could you do that you haven't done yet? What made you decide you're done now? What did you accomplish? What is still unsolved, right? Helping kids to be much more, across all ages, to be much more process-oriented in their own work, rather than product-oriented. So you're producing a product maybe, but that product reflects a whole lot of design decisions and values and beliefs and opportunities you had along the way that weren't the only way to do it, right? There's no one answer. So I would recommend, for those who really want to look at what this can look like, engage with the materials that the National Academy of Education in the United States has been putting out. I'm somewhat involved in that work. Engage with things like Harvard Project Zero has some really beautiful work by like David Perkins and Ron Richard on making thinking visible, apprenticeship in thinking, right? These notions that rather than learning discrete stuff, you're apprenticing yourself to another thinker to learn how to think like them. And then along the way, you're going to learn a bunch of stuff. You got to learn these things to be able to think like that in math, or to be able to think like that in science, to know how to design a systematic experiment that would actually test what you want to know, and to know what you want to know, like what's worth knowing, right? You need to sort of practice it with other people and actually become aware of your own thinking and processes, which also means that you're going back to what we said before, really it's essential that you're providing young people the opportunity to hold their own agency. We design the structure, they design the work, right? And it needs to be set up in a way that the work they design is likely to be really a productive opportunity for them to develop themselves and to learn something. And that's the key to really good educational design. And there are schools that do this very well, but like I said, they're just not mainstream.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm hearing, for example, the engagement with building meaning in what students are learning, and focusing in that meaning making along the way they are learning other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned that for that, even though we are going to see different presentations of the processes and developments of education along different cultures, we need one, or at least one of what you mentioned, a core value is trust.
Yes.
How can we link this trust with hope? Because for me, it's really difficult, since I am a teacher in the humanities department and I teach things like that, ethics and meaning and things like that. But I see my students, and sometimes I see what I'm going to teach them in the world we are living, the world my generation helped build. So, and of course, I don't want to tell them it's your turn, because that's not fair.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, I think we're in it together, right? And I think insofar as you can be honest about modeling these kinds of reflective behaviors and thinking about what did we build? Where are you? What do we care about now? How is the world changing? Like actually teaching kids to think about real problems and the ways that things have changed over time, and actually asking them to have opinions, but then to query those opinions and to learn along the way. And to query each other's, and to make it normative for people to sort of criticize or push back on other people's thinking and stuff. I mean, that is something that even in my lab group as a professor, right, the graduate students and the postdocs and the junior scientists who are around me, like mention that it takes them getting used to when they get to my lab, that we're constantly, criticizing is too strong a word, it sounds negative, but we're constantly asking and pushing back. And they do this to me too. Those who have been in the group, absolutely saying, well, Mary Helen, I'm not sure I agree. What if I push back and said this and that? And then I can think about it and say, well, maybe you're right. Or no, I think I didn't explain it well. What I really mean is this, or let me think about it some more and we'll come back. Or what did you think? Because you come from a very different experience, than we do. And you're coming from a neuroscience background where you're coming from a psychology, and you're coming from, an indigenous context where you've been building schools with tribal values. How could we think together about and reconcile the real nature of the essential problem here? And helping kids to get used to that, for that to be normal, and what's exciting and fun about the process of learning, first means the teachers need to really know the domain. Because you can't fake what you know in a place like that. You can't just make it up. You have to be able to really understand what is the content that you're trying to get kids to engage with. So that's one thing. And then another thing is you have to recognize and have skills for supporting productive discussion. Knowing what kinds of discussions are productive and what are just sort of flopping around, expressing opinions and saying stuff, and like everybody's engaged in the sense that they're thinking. I mean, in the sense that they're talking, but not in the sense that they're really thinking. And I think also there are some things that we build into education systems that directly undermine this kind of thinking, which is, for example, time limits, and the kinds of really strict sort of, you have to do it fast, you have to get it right in order for it to be something worth talking about, right? There are times when you do need to get in and be able to do it fast and right, because those are instrumental tools that you need to teach yourself to be able to really adapt quickly in order to be able to solve these big problems. And if you're stuck on solving these pieces, you're never going to get to the big problem. But that needs to be embedded in a much bigger story of what it means to be you in an educational space, than that being the main outcome, the main aim, the thing you're teaching to. And it needs to, every activity you engage in needs to be thought of as a developmental activity. How are you changing yourself by studying for this test? How are you growing your ability as a thinker through thinking about doing these math problems really efficiently? How is that changing your own mind and the way in which you see things in the world? And to help kids be explicit about that. It doesn't need to be a secret, right? I mean, even my little daughter, when she was in second grade, she's like, I don't know, 6, 7 years old, whatever, 7 years old, like, she would come home with these spelling word lists. And the first thing we would do before we started learning spelling all these words, which they didn't really do anymore after her, she was like the last year that did it, but we'd sit down and look at the list and say, like, what's the rule they're trying to get you to understand this week? Like, oh says ooh. Oh yeah, let's look across. Look at that. They all have ooh in them. Well, that's what they're trying to do. Okay, let's see all the ways you can use ooh. You know what I mean? Or whatever it is, right? And then with big kids, my own graduate students are like, why are we trying this interdisciplinary approach? Because we want to think about, is there a way we could push back on the assumption that this is a universal biological process? What if it was being shaped in this way? What experiment could we design to test that? And then you start to operationalize your ideas in terms of strategic steps that are very rigorously constructed, right? But always with the bigger mindset that you're testing something with bigger implications, that you understand why you're doing what you're doing. And it's a strategic reduction in order to be able to essentialize something that's going to give you an insight. And when you teach kids that that's what they're looking for in the world, that sets them up in a different way. I don't tell stories of my own kids, but like they're the ones I know the best, right? So now both of my kids are in university, right? One of them is about to finish. She's writing her dissertation, what am I saying, her honors thesis, right? And she's like, but Mom, it's like too much. I can't do all this. And it's like, they're giving me this stuff and they understand things about it that I don't. And I'm just like parroting. And she's like, I can see that I'm going to really grow myself by doing this. But right now they don't understand why I'm so slow is because I'm actually trying to formulate it. Like, knowing that about yourself, that you can see yourself growing through the process, makes it possible for you to stick with the process. You're not just doing it so you can get a mark on your transcript and graduate with honors. You're doing it because it's growing your ability to think about really complex, big problems in this domain, right? Or like my son is interested in engineering and he just started this year as a freshman at UC Berkeley, which is, Berkeley is one of the University of California campuses, which is known for its engineering. And, it's tough. It's really tough. And, he and I were talking before he went, and I was like, what you're trying to do in university, you need to learn the stuff, you need to do the stuff, but what you really want to be doing is looking all the time. Where's the hole? Where's the thing that nobody's noticed goes together? What's the thing I could be good at? What's the thing I could use this for that hadn't been thought of yet? Right? Constantly be querying, ask people, why did you study it this way? Go talk with your professor and say like, well, couldn't this be used for that? Or is it not relevant to that? And like, there's this other thing that we talked about last week in my other class. Is that matter here? And constantly be looking to find the hole that you can grab onto and try to make something out of. Don't just passively wait for people to tell you what to learn and what to do and then give it back to them, right? You'll get through okay that way, but you'll figure out really how you could use your skills to make the world a better place, And, sending somebody out with that, they're constantly puzzling on like, but why? But where? What could this be for? Why am I doing this? Right? And constantly querying those things puts you in this very active agentic mind state, which is motivating, which helps you be resilient when inevitably you do badly and it's difficult, which is where we're at right now, halfway through the semester, right? And it helps you remember why you're trying to do it and what you could use it for. And then it actually enables you to be innovative with your skills later, potentially. Even if you end up doing the same job you would have done, now you're doing it with a much more active stance. You're doing it thinking like, how can I make this better? How could we do it even in a more efficient way? How could we do it in a way that's going to be, more effective? And you're constantly looking for that actively. But that's the kind of thing that we really, we don't just not support in traditional K through 12 education. We punish it. Right? We punish kids who are looking to make it more efficient and try to, right? I mean, and we need to move past the instrumental how and what to do in education and into the why and what kinds of developmental dispositions are we supporting? And then from there, we can start to really build out many kinds of what? People could do many different things in many different ways in education context and be fine. As long as the kids are coming away, right, with a set of core skills and values that help them work in the world from their own perspective. They don't have to all be the same. So we need to standardize the developmental trajectory intentions, not the actual pieces that come out. And I think rethinking the system like that gives teachers much more agency, gives them much more latitude to really get inventive. But they can only get inventive in responsible ways when they actually understand what they're aiming for, which is complex, deep thinking, not knowing this or that only.
Yeah. And especially, we should be able to regain the pleasure of learning and teaching, for example.
That's right. Yeah, which teachers are not robots, right?
Yeah, of course.
They're not just going to stand up there and just read this thing and then like, you know, next thing the kids just do it. And that's like, they're not all the same. They're human beings. It's really very much like parenting, teaching. It's kind of specialized parenting. It's chemistry parenting or humanities parenting or mathematics parenting. I'm teaching you how to be my mathematical child for a little while. Let's think together about what it would be like if you were a mathematician. And that's what we're doing in math class together right now, right? And that's a really different way to frame the work than like, I know stuff, you don't, and I'm going to give it to you. And your job is to give it back, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I have the experience. I have 4 children. They are all grown-ups, but of course, my most important learnings in my life has to do with learning what they did, what they said. For example, my oldest daughter, when she was 3 years old, he told me, "Mom, why are you shouting? Why are you telling me not to shout? Shout." 3 years old.
Yeah.
From that moment on, I
realized, whoa, I was shouting. I never realized that before, you know?
Who's the teacher? Who's the mother here?
Yeah.
But yeah, we have a lot of more questions and subjects to and make analysis of, but our time is up.
Yeah.
We don't want you getting exhausted because you have a lot of ideas, and of course we can talk a lot more about the topic, and I hope this is the first of other conversations we are able to have with you.
I would love that.
Thank you very much for this conversation. I was thrilled. I have a lot of things to think about of what you said, and I hope we'll see you very soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much, Dr. Immordino-Yang.
Thank you. I appreciate it.